You see, some men buy land to build an empire, others do it to escape one. Nate Callahan was the second kind. He had a past, a life filled with smoke-filled boardrooms and backstabbing deals in a city that gleamed with false promises. He'd traded it all for the brutal honesty of the Montana mountains, for the clean scent of pine and the vast, aching silence of his valley. He'd built a fortress of solitude called the Callahan Ranch, believing its fences could keep the world out. He was wrong. The world came for him in the form of a storm, not just any storm, but a howling beast that clawed at the mountains and hurled snow like a volley of knives. It wasn't natural. It felt personal. The wind didn't just whistle, it screamed. A loose shutter on the barn banged a frantic rhythm against the wall, a desperate drumbeat heralding disaster. Inside that barn was the only thing Nate still loved, his horses. Especially Jet, a black thoroughbred with a spirit as wild as the land itself, a creature worth more than most men's entire lives. A low, terrified whinny cut through the roar of the wind, and it sent a blade of ice through Nate's heart. He ripped the heavy barn door open, and a sheet of frozen rain slashed his face. The sight inside was a punch to the gut. Jet was down, lying on his side, his breath coming in ragged, panicked bursts. Blood, dark and stark against the golden straw, stained his flank. A jagged piece of splintered wood from the wall had pierced his skin, but that wasn't the worst of it. Above the terrified horse, the main support beam of the roof was cracked clean in two. It sagged dangerously, groaning under the weight of the snow and wind. One more powerful gust, and the entire structure would collapse, crushing the life out of his prized stallion. And carved into that splintered beam, almost hidden in the shadows, was a symbol, a strange, swirling emblem that looked like a coiled snake. It wasn't from the storm. It was deliberate. Someone had done this. "Damn it!" Nate snarled, his voice ripped away by the wind. He ignored the groaning roof and the strange carving. The horse was all that mattered. He shoved his shoulder into the broken stall gate, his muscles screaming in the cold, and hauled the massive animal back to its feet. The horse, terrified but trusting, leaned into him, into the calm strength he projected. He guided Jet to a safer stall, his boots sinking into the swamp of mud, manure, and icy water that now covered the barn floor. He worked with a feverish intensity, his mind racing. Who would do this? Why? The storm was a perfect cover for an act of pure malice. By the time the last of the wind died down, and a pale, wounded dawn broke over the valley, the eastern wall of the barn was a ruin. Planks hung like the broken ribs of a giant skeleton. The smell of damp, rotting hay was thick in the air. Nate stood there, soaked to the bone, his chest heaving. He was a man used to solving any problem with his own two hands, but this was different. This wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a message, and he had no idea who sent it or why. The solitude he'd paid a fortune for had just been shattered. He was a target. 3 days later, the ranch was still a wreck, and Nate's temper was even worse. He rode into the nearest town, a place he actively despised. He hated the gossip, the way people stared at the millionaire hermit who'd vanished from high society. But he was out of options. He needed help, hands to fix the damage, but more than that, he needed eyes and ears. He needed to know who was moving through his valley. He pinned a simple note to the wall of the local saloon, right next to a wanted poster for some forgotten outlaw. Help needed. Repairing barn, cleaning stables, daily pay, no questions asked. He didn't expect a soul to show up. The townsfolk kept their distance. They were intimidated by his wealth and confused by his reclusive nature. They whispered stories about him, about the life he'd left behind, about the powerful enemies he might have made. For 3 days, the only answer to his note was the cold Montana wind. He started to believe he was truly alone out here, with an unknown enemy lurking in the shadows. He'd sit on his porch at night, the grand, empty house behind him feeling more like a tomb than a home, and he'd stare at the dark line of the trees, a rifle resting across his lap. Then, on the fourth morning, as the frost began to melt on the fence posts, he saw her, a figure, thin and solitary, walking up the long dirt road to his ranch. She moved with a strange deliberation, as if every step was a battle against an unseen force. A battered gray shawl was pulled tight around her shoulders, and a worn-out hat hid most of her face. She looked less like a person seeking work and more like a ghost being blown in by the wind. She stopped at the gate, and all Nate could see was a sliver of pale cheek, sharp with a hunger that went deeper than food. "I'm here for the job," she said. Her voice caught him off guard. It was quiet, steady, but frayed at the edges, like a rope that had been pulled taut for far too long. There was no hope in it, only grim determination. "You know how to clean stables?" Nate asked, his tone rougher than he'd intended. He was suspicious of everyone and everything right now. She just gave a small, sharp nod. "Name's Linda. Linda Rock." She didn't ask about the pay. She didn't ask where she would stay. She didn't ask a single question. She just followed him to the ruined barn, her eyes scanning the damage with an unnerving stillness. She took in the splintered beams, the gaping holes, and the strange symbol carved into the wood. When her eyes fell on the symbol, she flinched. It was barely perceptible, a slight intake of breath, a flicker of her gaze. But Nate saw it. He saw the flash of pure, undiluted fear. She knew what it was. Without a word, she rolled up her sleeves, revealing forearms that were thin but laced with wiry strength, and she got to work. She wasn't just a drifter looking for a meal. She was connected to this, and Nate knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that hiring this woman was either the biggest mistake of his life or the only way he was going to survive what was coming. Linda Rock was a woman made of secrets and silence. She moved through the wrecked barn with a frightening efficiency, her focus absolute. She didn't flinch at the filth or the stench of decay or the biting wind that snaked through the broken walls. It was as if she had seen far worse things than a ruined barn. Nate watched her from a distance, pretending to sort through salvageable lumber, but his eyes never left her. She started with the corner where his stallion, Jet, had been injured. She scrubbed the blood-stained straw and wood until the grain showed clean again, her movements methodical, almost military in their precision. Who taught her to clean like that? As if she were erasing evidence. He saw her pause when she worked near the main support beam, the one with the coiled snake symbol carved into it. Her back was to him, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands stilled for just a fraction of a second before she forced herself to keep moving. She was deliberately avoiding that spot, cleaning all around it, leaving the symbol untouched, like a shrine to some dark god. Nate's mind, usually so clear and focused on logistics and numbers, was now a whirlwind of questions. Who was this woman? Where did she come from? Why did the sight of a simple carving send a jolt of terror through her? He wanted to stride over, grab her by the arm and demand answers. But the set of her jaw, the fierce, protective bubble of silence she wore like armor, told him that pushing her would only make her run. And he couldn't let her run. Not yet. She was a clue. She never looked him in the eye. Her gaze was always down, on her work, on the ground, anywhere but at him. It wasn't shyness. It was deliberate evasion, as if she was afraid of what he might see in her eyes. Or perhaps, what she might see in his. By sunset, the barn was transformed. The stench of manure and rot was replaced by the clean, sharp smell of fresh hay and scrubbed timber. Linda rinsed her raw, reddened hands in the horse trough, the icy water doing little to soothe them. She wiped them on her worn skirt, picked up her tattered shawl, and turned to leave without a single word. "Wait," Nate called out. She stopped but didn't turn around. "The pay," he said, holding out a few coins. She hesitated, then walked back and took them, her fingers barely brushing his. The touch was cold, fleeting, but it sent a jolt through him. He watched her silhouette vanish down the winding road, her small figure swallowed by the deepening shadows of the forest. She didn't look back. That night, the ranch felt colder and emptier than ever before. The grand house, which he'd built as a monument to his own solitude, now felt like a prison. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, listening, waiting. He sat at the long, polished mahogany dining table, a plate of untouched supper growing cold in front of him. His thoughts weren't on the mysterious attack on his barn anymore. They were on the woman who had cleaned it, the woman who was terrified of a simple symbol. Why did she come here, of all places? Was it a coincidence, or was she sent? His instincts, honed by years of navigating the treacherous currents of the business world, screamed at him that there were no coincidences. He couldn't sleep. The image of her raw hands, her averted eyes, and that flash of terror burned in his mind. He rose before dawn, a new, unsettling thought taking root in his soul. This woman wasn't just a key to understanding the attack on his ranch. The attack was about her. The next morning, he was waiting by the barn when she appeared on the road, a lone figure against the rising sun. He was holding something in his hand, a small object he'd found in the straw where she had been working, something she must have dropped. It was a small wooden bird, intricately carved from a piece of dark wood, worn smooth with time. It was a beautiful, delicate thing, and he had a feeling that if he showed it to her, her carefully constructed wall of silence would come crashing down. He didn't know what he was searching for. Answers? Yes. But something else was stirring within him, something unfamiliar and dangerous. He was no longer just a man with a problem. He was a man with a mystery. And Linda Rock was standing right in the center of it. The morning frost clung to the ranch fences like a shroud of powdered glass. Nate stood by the barn, the cold air doing nothing to cool the racing of his mind. He held the small, carved bird in his palm, its smooth wood a stark contrast to the rough calluses on his hand. This little piece of wood felt like a key, and he was about to see what lock it opened. Linda arrived just as the sun cleared the mountain peaks, her shawl pulled tight, her face a mask of weary resolve. She gave him a curt nod and headed straight for the barn, ready to resume her silent, relentless work. "You dropped this," Nate said, his voice cutting through the morning stillness. He held out his hand, palm up, revealing the bird. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The color drained from Linda's face, leaving it a sickly, ashen gray. Her eyes, which had so carefully avoided his for a full day, now snapped to his, wide with pure, unadulterated terror. It wasn't just fear. It was the look of a cornered animal seeing the hunter raise his rifle. She didn't speak. She lunged. Her hand shot out and snatched the bird from his palm with a desperate quickness that stunned him. She clutched it to her chest as if it were a living thing, her knuckles white. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. "Where did you find this?" she whispered, her voice trembling so badly it was barely audible. "In the straw, near where you were cleaning," Nate said, keeping his own voice level. He took a step closer. "It's just a carving, Linda. What are you so afraid of?" "You don't understand," she breathed, taking a step back for everyone he took forward. "You can't understand." She looked past him, her eyes darting toward the woods, toward the long road leading away from the ranch. She was about to run. He could see it in the frantic energy that suddenly consumed her. "Running won't help," Nate said, his voice low and urgent. He pointed to the ruined section of the barn. "That symbol, the coiled snake. You recognized it, didn't you? The same person who carved that snake is connected to this bird, aren't they?" Her composure shattered. A sob escaped her lips, a raw, painful sound she choked back immediately. She shook her head, not in denial, but in utter despair. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "Don't ask me. You don't want to be involved in this. Just let me go. I'll leave. I'll never come back." "It's too late for that," Nate said, his own fear and frustration hardening his tone. "Whoever they are, they didn't just attack you. They attacked my ranch. They tried to kill my horse. Your trouble is my trouble now, whether I want it to be or not. So you're going to tell me what's going on." She stared at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. For a moment, he thought she would break. He saw a flicker of something, a desperate urge to confide, to share the crushing weight she was carrying. But then, the mask snapped back into place. The fear was replaced by a cold, hard resignation. "There's nothing to tell," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I saw your notice. I need the work, that's all." She turned on her heel and walked into the barn, leaving him standing alone in the cold morning air. She didn't run. She went back to work, scrubbing and hauling and sweeping with a frantic, renewed intensity, as if she could physically scour away the secrets that clung to her. Nate watched her, a storm of anger and confusion raging inside him. He had the key, but she had slammed the lock shut in his face. He knew, with absolute certainty, that she was in terrible danger. And by being here, she had put him in danger too. He spent the rest of the day in a state of high alert. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. He worked on repairing the fence line, but his gaze kept snapping back to the barn, to the small, determined woman working inside it. She was hiding something big, something that got people hurt, something that made powerful enemies. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the valley in shades of bruised purple and orange, Nate made a decision. He was a man of logic, of direct action. If she wouldn't give him the answers, he would have to find them himself. He would follow her. He knew it was a violation, a crossing of a line. But his life, his ranch, everything he had built to protect himself from the world, was now under threat. He had a right to know why. When Linda finished her work, she left as she always did, a silent shadow melting into the forest path. Nate gave her a 10-minute head start. Then, he saddled his quietest horse, a sure-footed mare, and set off after her, keeping to the trees that lined the trail. The path grew narrower, twisting deeper into the woods. The air grew colder, smelling of damp earth and pine. He kept his distance, moving like a hunter, his heart pounding with a mixture of guilt and grim necessity. After nearly a mile, she veered off the main path, disappearing into a thick patch of underbrush where no trail existed. Nate dismounted, tying his horse to a low-hanging branch, and followed on foot, moving as silently as he could. He pushed through the last of the branches and stopped dead. His blood ran cold. Before him was a clearing, and in that clearing was a cabin, or what was left of one. It was a dilapidated shack, leaning so far to one side it looked like a strong wind would turn it to splinters. A threadbare blanket served as its door. But it wasn't the poverty of the place that shocked him. It was what he heard coming from inside. Laughter. The soft, high-pitched laughter of children. He crept closer, his heart hammering against his ribs. He peered through a wide crack in the rotting wall, and what he saw broke something inside him. Linda was on her knees on the dirt floor, in front of a small, smoky fire. Her face, which had been a mask of fear and hardship all day, was transformed. It was illuminated by a tenderness so profound it made his throat ache. A little barefoot girl with tangled blonde hair was wrapped in her arms. 2 young boys were wrestling playfully nearby with a wooden spoon. And an older girl, maybe 11 or 12, stood guard by the blanket door, her expression serious and watchful. 4 children. The secret she was protecting wasn't just her own, it was them. The realization hit Nate like a physical blow. The reason she worked so hard, the reason she endured the fear, the reason she wouldn't accept charity, it was all for them. That scrap of bread she saved each day wasn't for her. It was for them. As he watched, Linda pulled the small carved bird from her pocket. She held it up in the firelight, and the children grew quiet, their eyes wide. She began to whisper a story about the bird, her voice a soft, hypnotic lullaby. Nate couldn't hear the words, but he could see the magic she was weaving in that broken-down shack. She was creating a world for them, a tiny island of warmth and love in a sea of cold and fear. He backed away slowly, slipping back into the shadows of the forest. The image of that small family burned into his mind. He rode back to his ranch in a stunned silence, the cold night air doing nothing to clear his head. He had started the day thinking Linda was a threat, a liability, but now he saw the truth. She wasn't the danger, she was the one in danger, and by following her, he hadn't just found answers. He had found 4 more reasons to fight. He now understood that the coiled snake gang wasn't just after her. They were after her children. The stakes of this silent war had just been raised impossibly high. And Nate Callahan, the man who wanted to be left alone, was standing right in the middle of it. The image of that ramshackle cabin, of those 4 small faces huddled around a meager fire, haunted Nate through a sleepless night. The grand, empty silence of his house felt obscene. He had more rooms than he could count, pantries full of food, and a fortune sitting in a bank, while a mother and her 4 children were living in a shack that was one storm away from collapsing. The next morning, a hard frost silvered the valley. Before Linda was due to arrive, Nate acted. He couldn't just offer her money or food. Her pride was a fortress he now understood and respected. So he had to be clever. He filled a sturdy burlap sack with essentials: a bag of flour, a slab of smoked bacon, potatoes, a bar of lye soap, and a small tin of coffee. He also added a pair of thick leather work gloves. He didn't leave it on the porch. He hung it on a nail inside the barn, in the stall she had so meticulously cleaned, as if it had been left there by accident. A quiet offering, not charity. When Linda arrived, she went about her work with the same silent intensity as before. Nate watched from the house as she entered the barn. A few minutes later, she re-emerged, standing motionless in the doorway, her back to him. She stood there for a long time, so still she could have been a statue. Then she slowly turned and went back inside. When she left that evening, the sack was gone. Nate felt a small measure of relief, but when he went to the barn, he found something on the workbench that stopped him cold. It was one of the coins he had paid her the day before. Next to it was a small, crudely drawn picture on a scrap of paper. It was a drawing of a bird, just like the carving, but this one was smiling. It was a child's drawing. There was no note, but the message was deafeningly clear. We pay our own way. We are not beggars. A fierce, painful admiration swelled in Nate's chest. This woman's pride was made of steel. He folded the small drawing carefully and tucked it into his pocket, right next to the child's smiling bird. He was dealing with someone whose dignity was her last and most ferocious defense. He couldn't break it, so he had to find a way to support it. The next few days, their strange, silent dance continued. He would leave things for her: a warm blanket forgotten in the hayloft, a sharper knife for cutting twine, a lantern with a full reservoir of oil. He never mentioned the items. She never acknowledged them. But he would see the blanket wrapped around her shoulders on her walk home. He saw her using the knife. Small, unspoken concessions, a fragile truce in their silent war of wills. Their silence began to change. It was no longer just tense and suspicious. It became a shared space, a quiet understanding. Sometimes he would work near her, repairing a bridle or oiling a saddle, and the comfortable quiet was broken only by the sound of their labor. He started to look forward to it, to her quiet, grounding presence. One afternoon, a new player entered the game. Nate was tightening a hinge on the main barn door when he saw movement at the edge of the tree line. It was the oldest girl, Nal. She stepped out of the woods cautiously, clutching a small woven basket. She looked nervous, but her eyes held a spark of her mother's fierce resolve. She marched right up to him. "You the one leaving things for my mama?" she asked, her voice small but clear. Nate was taken aback. He knelt down to her level. "I suppose I am." The girl held out the basket. Inside were 6 perfect pale blue eggs. They were still warm. "Mama says we don't take what we can't pay for," she said, reciting a line that had clearly been drilled into her. "She says thank you for the gloves. Her hands don't bleed anymore." Nate felt something wrench in his gut. He took the basket, his large, rough hands cradling it, as if it held solid gold. "You tell your mama thank you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. The girl gave a quick, shy smile, then turned and bolted back toward the woods, her duty done. Nate stood there for a long time, staring at the 6 perfect eggs. It was the richest payment he had ever received. He had dealt in stocks and bonds worth millions, but they were just paper. This was real. This was sacrifice and pride and honor, all nestled in a small, handmade basket. That night, something inside Nate Callahan shifted for good. He was no longer just an observer, a protector from a distance. He was involved. That little girl with the basket of eggs had tied him to their family with a cord of gratitude and respect that felt stronger than steel. He sat on his porch, the cold air biting at his skin, and he made a new vow. It wasn't enough to help them survive. He had to give them a life. He had to get them out of that crumbling shack and away from the shadow of the coiled snake. He didn't know how. Linda's pride was a wall he couldn't seem to climb. But as he stared out at the dark mountains, an idea began to form. A desperate, dangerous idea. He couldn't just offer her a home. That was charity. But what if her home was destroyed? What if she had no choice but to accept his help? His eyes drifted to the sky, where dark clouds were beginning to gather on the horizon, crawling down from the peaks like hungry wolves. A storm was coming, a real one this time. And Nate realized, with a chilling sense of purpose, that this storm might be the very weapon he needed. He wouldn't have to destroy her home. Nature, and the shoddy construction of the cabin, would likely do it for him. He would let the storm be the villain, so he could be the savior. It was a cold, calculating thought, the kind of thought that had made him a millionaire in the city. He hated that part of himself. But as he thought of those 4 children sleeping on a dirt floor, he knew he would do it. He would use any weapon at his disposal, even a hurricane, to keep them safe. The storm that rolled in wasn't just a storm. It was a biblical deluge, an act of war by the sky itself. The wind shrieked, tearing at the ranch with a malevolent fury that made the previous storm feel like a summer breeze. Nate stood on his porch, the wind ripping at his coat, and stared toward the dark line of pines. His calculated plan suddenly felt like a terrible sin. He had wished for a storm to force her hand, but this was a monster. Rain didn't fall. It came down in solid horizontal sheets, drumming on the barn roof like 1,000 frantic war drums. The horses were going mad inside, their panicked cries barely audible over the roar of the gale. He spent an hour in the barn, calming the animals, adding extra braces to the doors, his gut twisting with a sickening dread. The image of that flimsy cabin tormented him. The thought of those children inside, listening to this monster tear their world apart. It was unbearable. Pride be damned. He couldn't wait. He couldn't risk it. He burst out of the barn and ran toward the house, the mud sucking at his boots. He had to go get them. Now. But just as he reached the porch, a flash of lightning illuminated the entire valley in a ghostly, strobing glare. And in that split second of light, he saw it. 3 riders, 3 figures on horseback, low in their saddles, moving through the storm toward his ranch. They weren't fighting the storm. They were using it as cover. It was them, the coiled snake gang. Nate's blood ran cold. This wasn't a coincidence. They had been waiting for this, for the moment when nature itself provided the perfect shield for their attack. He sprinted inside, his heart hammering, and grabbed the heavy Winchester rifle from its rack above the fireplace. He checked the load, his hands moving with practiced speed. The millionaire hermit was gone. In his place was a man defending his territory. He peered through the window, rain lashing against the glass. The riders were closer now. He could make out their shapes, dark and menacing against the churning gray sky. He expected them to ride for the house, but they didn't. They angled toward the forest path, the path that led directly to Linda's cabin. A horrifying realization dawned on him. They weren't here for him. They weren't here to attack the ranch. They were using the storm to abduct her and the children. No, he breathed, the word a knot of fury in his throat. He didn't waste another second debating. He flew out the back door, saddled his strongest horse in the driving rain, and rode headlong into the tempest. He didn't take the main path. They would see him. He cut through the high pasture, taking a longer, more treacherous route that would bring him out on the far side of the clearing. The ride was a nightmare. The wind threatened to rip him from the saddle. Branches torn from trees flew through the air like spears. His horse stumbled and slid in the mud, but Nate urged it on, his mind locked on a single, terrifying image: those men reaching the cabin before he did. He burst through the tree line into the clearing, just as the 3 riders were dismounting in front of the shack. The cabin was already failing. One side of its roof caved in. The blanket door ripped away and flapping madly in the wind. He saw the leader, a broad-shouldered man with a cruel, sneering face, kick at the doorframe. "Linda, we know you're in there. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Nate didn't call out. He didn't give a warning. He raised the Winchester to his shoulder, the rain streaming down his face, and fired a single shot into the air. Crack! The sound ripped through the howl of the storm. The 3 men froze, spinning around, their hands flying to the pistols on their belts. They stared into the darkness of the trees, trying to locate the source of the shot. "Get away from them!" Nate roared, his voice booming with a rage he hadn't felt in years. Before they could react, he spurred his horse forward, charging out of the woods and directly at them. He wasn't aiming to kill. He was aiming to scatter, to disrupt, to become a force of chaos they hadn't anticipated. His horse, a powerful beast, slammed into one of the men, sending him flying into the mud. Nate swung the butt of his rifle, catching a second man across the side of the head as he tried to draw his weapon. The man crumpled to the ground. The leader, the one with the sneering face, finally got his pistol free. He raised it, aiming at Nate, but just as he was about to fire, a small, fierce figure launched itself out of the broken cabin. It was Linda. In her hands was a heavy, cast-iron skillet, and she swung it with all the force of her desperate, terrified soul. The skillet connected with the man's gun hand with a sickening crunch. The pistol flew from his grasp, and he howled in pain, clutching his shattered fingers. "Get the kids!" Nate yelled at her, leaping from his horse. "Get them into the woods, now!" The 2 conscious men were scrambling to their feet, their faces masks of shock and fury. Nate stood between them and the cabin, his rifle leveled, his eyes burning with cold fire. "You're not taking them," he said, his voice deadly calm. Inside the cabin, he could hear the children crying. Linda was already herding them out the back, into the relative safety of the dense forest. Nal, the oldest, clutched the little one to her chest, her face pale but determined. The leader stared at Nate, cradling his broken hand. "You have no idea who you're messing with, old man," he spat. "Thorne wants the box. He'll get it one way or another." Thorne. The name hit Nate like a physical blow. Marcus Thorne, the ruthless railroad baron, the man whose corruption Nate had tried to expose years ago, the man who had ruined his reputation and driven him from the city. This wasn't some random gang of thugs. This was his own past, rising from its grave to hunt him down. The coiled snake. It was Thorne's secret symbol, the mark of his inner circle, the men who did his dirty work. This wasn't about Linda anymore. It had always been about him. She and her children hadn't brought the trouble to his door. They had simply been the bait. The realization was a cold, sharp blade twisting in his gut. The leader saw the look of recognition in Nate's eyes, and a slow, cruel grin spread across his face. "Oh, you remember him, don't you? He remembers you too, Callahan. He never forgets a loose end." The world seemed to slow down. The howling wind, the lashing rain, the crying children in the woods. It all faded into a dull roar. There was only the man in front of him, the living embodiment of the past he could never escape, and the certain knowledge that this was no longer just a fight to protect a family. This was a war he had fled from years ago. and it had just found him. He could either run again, or he could stand and fight. He looked over his shoulder, toward the dark woods where Linda and her children were hiding. He heard the youngest one, Ruth, let out a terrified cry. His choice was made. He wasn't running anymore. "Thorn can come and face me himself," Nate said, his voice dropping to a low growl. He cocked the hammer on his rifle. "But you won't be walking away from this." A new storm had just broken over the valley, one made of men and secrets and old hatreds. And Nate Callahan was standing right in its eye. The standoff in the clearing was a frozen moment of violence waiting to happen. Two of Thorn's thugs were on their feet, mud-caked and furious. Their leader, Raymond, clutched his broken hand, his face contorted in a mask of pain and hatred. Nate stood before them, a solitary figure of defiance, his rifle steady, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead. "You're a dead man, Callahan," Raymond snarled. "Thorn will peel the skin from your bones for this." "He'll have to find me first," Nate replied, his eyes cold as ice. "But you three have a more immediate problem. He didn't want a bloodbath, not with the children so close. He just needed them gone." He took a half-step forward, a silent promise of aggression. The two thugs exchanged a nervous glance. They were hired muscle, not soldiers. They had signed on for an easy abduction, not a firefight in a hurricane with a madman who looked like he had nothing left to lose. Raymond saw their hesitation, and his face twisted with rage. "Don't just stand there, you fools! Get him!" But his men were already backing away, hands held up in a gesture of surrender. "This ain't what we signed up for, Ray," one of them mumbled. "He broke your hand with a frying pan and a crazy woman. Let's just go." Before Raymond could argue, they turned and scrambled for their horses, hauling their dazed companion with them. They fled into the storm-lashed woods, abandoning their leader without a second thought. Raymond stared after them, disbelief warring with fury. Then he looked at Nate, his eyes burning with a venomous promise. "This isn't over. Thorn will send more. He'll send an army if he has to. He'll burn this whole valley to the ground to get what he wants." "Then tell him to come," Nate said, his voice flat. Raymond spat a curse into the mud, then stumbled toward his horse and galloped away, swallowed by the rain and darkness. The silence that descended was more deafening than the storm. Nate stood there for a long moment, the rifle heavy in his hands, his mind reeling from the revelation. Thorn. After all these years. It was almost impossible to believe. "Nate?" Linda's voice, small and trembling, came from the edge of the woods. He turned to see her stepping into the clearing, the 4 children huddled behind her like frightened chicks. He lowered the rifle, the adrenaline beginning to drain away, leaving a bone-deep weariness in its place. "It's okay," he said, his voice softer than he expected. "They're gone. You're safe." "For now," she whispered, her eyes wide with a terror that went far beyond the storm. He said a name, Thorn. Nate nodded grimly. "We need to get you and the children to the ranch. Now. The cabin isn't safe. Nothing out here is." The journey back was a grueling ordeal. The mud was a treacherous mire, and the wind howled like a legion of ghosts. Nate carried the youngest, Ruth, wrapped in his coat, while Linda and Nal guided the 2 boys, Leo and Tom. They moved as a single desperate unit, united by the shared terror of the night. When they finally stumbled into the warm, dry kitchen of the ranch house, the relief was so overwhelming it was dizzying. The children, exhausted and soaked, collapsed onto the rug in front of the massive stone fireplace. Nate stoked the flames until they roared to life, casting a golden, flickering glow over the room. He handed Linda a thick wool blanket. She wrapped it around herself, but her body still trembled, not from the cold, but from shock. "You knew him," she said. It wasn't a question. "Thorn, you knew who he was." Nate sank into a heavy wooden chair, the weight of the last decade crashing down on him. He looked at this woman, at her brave, frightened children, and knew he owed her the truth, the whole truth. I did more than know him, Nate began, his voice low and raspy. I tried to destroy him. He told her everything. He told her about his life in the city, a world of power and influence. He told her about Marcus Thorne, a man who built his railroad empire on a foundation of corruption, bribery, and violence. Nate had been Thorne's business rival, one of the few men who dared to stand against him. I gathered evidence, Nate said, his eyes distant, lost in the memory. Proof of his crimes, land grabs, political payoffs, even a few accidents that weren't accidents at all. I was going to expose him, ruin him. What happened? Linda asked, her voice barely a whisper. A bitter smile touched Nate's lips. Thorne was smarter, more ruthless. Before I could go public, he framed me. He fabricated evidence, made it look like I was the one running the scheme. He bought witnesses, judges, newspapers. He turned my world upside down overnight. He didn't just beat me, he erased me. I lost everything, my company, my reputation, my friends. He fell silent, the crackling of the fire filling the void. So you ran, Linda said softly. You came here. I didn't run, Nate corrected her, his voice hardening. I retreated. I built this place as a fortress, a place where his world couldn't touch me. I thought if I just disappeared, he would forget about me. He let out a harsh, humorless laugh. I was a fool. Men like Thorne don't forget. They don't forgive. Now it was Linda's turn. Her story tumbled out, a torrent of fear and pain held back for far too long. Her husband, the man she thought she had married, wasn't just a petty criminal. He was one of Thorne's men. Her father, a master woodcarver, had been forced to create a series of intricately designed puzzle boxes for Thorne, boxes used to transport illicit goods and money. But the last box was different, Linda said, her voice trembling as she clutched the small wooden bird in her hand. My father, he knew Thorne was going to get rid of him once the job was done. So he built a secret compartment inside the box. He put documents in there, ledgers, letters, proof of everything Thorne had done. The same kind of proof you had. A wave of understanding washed over Nate. And he made a key. Linda nodded, tears finally tracking paths down her dirt-stained cheeks. This bird, she held it up. It's not just a toy. It's part of the key. There are 4 of them. He gave one to each of the children before Thorne's men, before they killed him. He told me the birds would show me the way to the real key, and the key would open the box and set us free. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with dizzying speed. Thorne doesn't know where the box is, Nate realized aloud. And he doesn't have the key. He thinks you do. That's why he sent Raymond. Not just to get the kids, but to torture you until you told him where it was. I don't know where the box is, Linda cried, her voice breaking. My father died before he could tell me. All I have are these birds and a riddle he told my oldest, Nala. Something about where the town's voice sleeps. They stared at each other across the fire-lit room, 2 fugitives from the same tyrant, their separate pasts suddenly, inextricably linked. Nate's old war wasn't over. It had just found a new front line, right here in his sanctuary. And Linda wasn't just a desperate mother. She held the one thing in the world that could vindicate him and destroy Thorne for good. Suddenly, the oldest girl, Nala, who had been sitting silently, watching them with eyes far too old for her years, spoke up. I know the riddle, she said, her voice clear and steady despite the fear that still clung to her. Papa told me, he said, when the fighting is done, the truth will be found where the town's voice sleeps, under the silent tongue. Nate and Linda looked at each other, a spark of desperate hope igniting between them. The town's voice, Nate muttered, his mind racing. The church bell. The town's voice is the church bell. Where it sleeps, Linda continued, her eyes widening. In the bell tower, under the silent tongue, the clapper, the part that strikes the bell. It was a long shot, a child's riddle, a dying man's last desperate gamble, but it was all they had. He's not just going to send thugs next time, Nate said, rising to his feet, a new dangerous energy surging through him. He's going to come himself. We don't have much time. The retreat was over. The man who had hidden from the world for a decade was back. He looked at Linda, at the children huddled by the fire, at the impossible odds stacked against them. For the first time in years, he wasn't fighting against something. He was fighting for something. "He wants a war," Nate said, a grim smile touching his lips. "Let's give him one." The dawn broke cold and clear, the storm having washed the world clean. But inside the ranch house, a different kind of storm was brewing, a storm of strategy and desperate courage. Nate Callahan, the recluse, was gone. In his place was the sharp-minded tactician who had once battled titans of industry. He spread a map of the county on the great mahogany table, his finger tracing roads, canyons, and railway lines. "Thorne won't expect us to move," Nate said, his voice crisp and authoritative. "He thinks he has us pinned down, terrified. He'll take a day or two to gather his forces for a full-scale assault on the ranch. That's our window." Linda stood opposite him, the fear in her eyes replaced by a hard, brittle resolve. "The key is in the church bell tower in town, but the town is full of people. How do we get to it without being seen? Thorne could have eyes everywhere." "We won't sneak," Nate said, a glint in his eye. "We'll create a distraction, something so big, so loud that every eye in town will be looking the other way." His plan was audacious, bordering on insane. He pointed to a narrow pass a few miles west of the town. "The main cattle trail runs through here. Jed, my neighbor, is moving a herd of 200 longhorns to the railhead tomorrow. With a little persuasion, that herd could get spooked. A stampede, heading straight for the main street of Helena." Linda stared at him, aghast. "A stampede? People could be hurt. It's too dangerous." "It won't reach the town," Nate assured her. "Jed and his men are the best drovers in this territory. They'll turn the herd at the last minute. But for a good 10 minutes, it will be pure chaos. Every man, woman, and child will be focused on the sound of 200 stampeding cattle. The church will be empty. That's when we move." He needed help. He rode out at first light to the neighboring ranch, his heart pounding with uncertainty. Jedediah Jed Stone was a leathery old cattleman, a man of few words and unshakable principles. Nate laid out the situation, the story of Thorne, the children, the key. He left nothing out. Jed listened, his weathered face unreadable, stroking his gray beard. When Nate was finished, the old man was silent for a full minute. Nate's hopes began to sink. Then, Jed spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Marcus Thorne," he said, the name tasting like poison. "I worked security for his railroad crews a lifetime ago. Quit after I saw him have a man beaten half to death for asking for an extra ration of water. Always knew that man was a snake." Jed looked Nate square in the eye. "A stampede, you say? My boys could use the practice. You tell me when." Relief, sharp and overwhelming, flooded through Nate. He had an ally. The plan was set for noon the next day. The tension in the ranch house was a palpable thing. Linda coached Nal, making sure the girl remembered the riddle precisely. The two boys, Leo and Tom, seemed to sense the gravity of the situation and played in hushed, nervous silence. Little Ruth clung to Linda's leg, her thumb firmly in her mouth. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, Nate and Linda rode for the town, taking a circuitous route through the foothills. They looked like any other rancher and his wife heading in for supplies. But under Nate's coat was a loaded pistol, and in Linda's saddlebag was a coil of rope and a grappling hook. They tethered their horses behind the saloon and made their way to the town square. The church stood tall and white, its steeple piercing the brilliant blue sky. It looked peaceful, serene, a perfect mask for the secret it held. They waited. Noon came and went. 1 o'clock. Nate felt a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. Had something gone wrong? Then they heard it. A low rumble, at first mistaken for distant thunder, but it grew steadily, a deep, earth-shaking vibration that you felt in your bones before you heard with your ears. Heads began to turn. People stepped out of the general store, the blacksmith's shop, their faces etched with confusion. The rumble became a roar, the sound of hundreds of cloven hooves pounding the dry earth. "Stampede!" a voice screamed from the edge of town. Panic erupted. The town square, moments before a scene of lazy commerce, became a blur of frantic motion. People scrambled for cover, dragging children, shouting warnings. The entire town's attention snapped westward, toward the cloud of dust rising on the horizon. "Now," Nate said. They moved fast, slipping through the chaos, unnoticed. The church was unlocked and blessedly empty. They raced up the narrow, winding stairs of the bell tower, dust motes dancing in the shafts of light slanting through the louvered windows. The great bronze bell hung before them, silent and immense. "Under the silent tongue," Linda whispered, pointing to the massive iron clapper hanging motionless inside the bell's mouth. Nate secured the rope and hook, tossing it over a heavy crossbeam. He climbed, his muscles straining until he was level with the clapper. He ran his hands over the cold, pitted iron. Nothing. It was solid. "There's nothing here," he called down, his heart sinking. "The riddle," Nala had insisted. "It's not just under it, it's in it. Papa was clever." Nate looked closer. Near the top of the clapper, where it attached to the pivot, was a small, almost invisible seam in the iron. He pulled a knife from his boot and worked the tip into the crack. With a grating screech, a small section of the clapper came loose. It wasn't solid, it was a cap, and inside the hollowed-out space was a small oilskin pouch. His heart leaped. He tore it open. Inside was a key. It was heavy, ornate, made of brass with a complex gear-like bit, and tied to its handle was another small, carved bird. He had it. He actually had it. He scrambled down the rope, landing lightly on the dusty floor. He held up the key, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. Linda's eyes shone with tears of relief, but their triumph was short-lived. The heavy oak doors of the church slammed open. 3 men stood silhouetted in the doorway. It was Raymond, his hand wrapped in a crude splint, and 2 other thugs, their faces grim. Thorne's eyes had been in town after all. "Going somewhere, Callahan?" Raymond sneered, stepping into the church. "The boss figured you might get clever. He sent us to wait." They were trapped. The bell tower had only one way in or out. "Give me the key," Raymond demanded, taking a step forward. Nate pushed Linda behind him. "You'll have to take it." "With pleasure," Raymond said, and his men fanned out, advancing slowly up the aisle. Suddenly, a voice boomed from the bell tower above them. "Hey, Raymond, you ever seen a 200-pound man fall from 50 feet? Everyone looked up. It was Jed. He must have slipped in behind them during the commotion. He was perched on a beam, holding a heavy block and tackle pulley in his hands. "This is gonna hurt," Jed said with a grin, and he let it go. The heavy iron pulley plummeted downwards, whistling through the air. It didn't hit anyone, but it smashed into the floorboards with the force of a cannonball, sending splinters flying. The thugs jumped back, startled. That was the only diversion Nate needed. "Go!" he yelled to Linda, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward a small sacristy door at the side of the altar. They burst through it into a small hallway. A window. It led to a narrow alleyway behind the church. Nate smashed the glass with his elbow, clearing the shards. He helped Linda through, then vaulted after her just as Raymond and his men burst into the hallway. They sprinted down the alley, the sounds of shouting behind them. Their horses were too far away. They were exposed, running in the open. Then a wagon, loaded with hay, came careening around the corner, pulled by a team of frantic horses. The driver was one of Jed's ranch hands. "Get in!" he yelled. Nate threw Linda into the back of the wagon, then dove in after her, burying them both deep in the hay as Raymond's men appeared at the end of the alley, firing their pistols. The shots went wide. The wagon thundered out of town, leaving the chaos of the stampede and Thorne's men behind. They had the key. They had escaped. They lay in the hay, breathless, their hearts pounding. Linda clutched the key to her chest, a look of pure, unadulterated hope on her face. They rode back to the ranch, believing the worst was over. They had won. But when they crested the final hill and saw the ranch house below, the hope in Linda's eyes turned to a scream of pure agony. The front door of the house was wide open, swinging gently in the breeze, and the children were gone. On the porch, weighted down by a rock, was a single, folded piece of paper. Nate's blood turned to ice. He leaped from the wagon before it had even stopped, sprinting to the house. He picked up the note. The handwriting was elegant, precise, and chillingly familiar. It was Thorne's. The message was 5 words long. The box for the children. Sunrise. The silence that fell over the ranch was heavier and more terrible than any storm. The laughter of the children was gone, replaced by an emptiness that consumed every room, every shadow. Linda sat at the kitchen table, her body rigid, staring at the wall, her face a blank mask of shock and grief. She hadn't said a word since they'd found the note. She just clutched the brass key in her hand, her knuckles white. Nate paced the room like a caged wolf, the 5 words of Thorne's note burning in his mind. The box for the children. Sunrise. It wasn't just a demand. It was a death sentence. Thorne wouldn't just take the box and let them go. He dealt in loose ends, and a mother and 4 children who knew his secrets were the loosest ends of all. Jed arrived just after dusk, his face a grim, stony mask. "My boys tracked 'em," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They didn't head for the railway. They went east, up into Shadow Canyon. It's a box canyon. 1 way in, 1 way out. He's chosen his killing ground." Nate stopped pacing, his hands clenching into fists. "He wants an exchange. He thinks I'll walk in there alone, hand over the box, and beg for the lives of the children. He thinks I'm still the man who ran from him 10 years ago." "Are you?" Jed asked, his gaze steady and sharp. "No," Nate said, a cold, hard certainty solidifying in his soul. "That man is dead." A flicker of life returned to Linda's eyes. She looked at Nate, a silent, desperate plea in her gaze. "The box," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I don't know where it is. My father never told me." All eyes in the room turned to the corner, where Nal, the oldest daughter, had been curled into a small ball. She had been left behind, overlooked by the kidnappers in their haste. Now, she slowly uncurled, her small face streaked with tears, but her eyes holding a spark of her father's courage. "I know," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I know where it is." Everyone froze. Nala took a shaky breath. "Papa, before he left, he made me promise. He said if anything happened to him, I had to move it. He said they would look in the cabin, under the floor, in the walls. He told me to put it where the forest sleeps." Nate knelt in front of her. "Nala, where is that? Where does the forest sleep?" "In the heart of the oldest tree," she whispered. "The giant fallen redwood down by the creek. It's hollow inside. He said it was the forest's cradle." Hope, fierce and desperate, flared in the room. They had a chance. Guided by Nal, Nate and Jed rode down to the creek in the dead of night. The fallen redwood was immense, a fallen giant from another age. They found the hollow, and there, covered in leaves and dirt, was a heavy, iron-strapped chest. It was a puzzle box, its surface covered in intricate carvings of birds and leaves, with no visible lock. They carried it back to the ranch. Linda looked at the box her father had built, the vessel of both their doom and their salvation. She looked at the key in her hand. "It's not enough," Nate said, his voice grim. "We can't just hand it over. It's a trap. He'll kill us all." "So we set our own trap," Jed said, a slow, dangerous grin spreading across his face. "Shadow Canyon. 1 way in, 1 way out. That works both ways. He thinks he has you cornered. He won't be expecting an army at his back." The rest of the night was a blur of frantic preparation. Jed rode out, a shadow in the moonlight, to gather his ranch hands. Tough, loyal men who despised the railroad baron and his hired thugs. Nate worked at the table, not on maps, but on the box itself. He studied the intricate carvings, the patterns, the way the wooden birds seemed to chase each other around the edges. "It's not just a lock," Nate muttered, his mind, once focused on corporate ledgers, now deciphering a dead man's masterpiece. It's a sequence. Your father was a genius, Linda. He built a trap inside a trap. He discovered that the key didn't just open the box. It had to be turned in a specific sequence, aligned with certain carvings on the lid. The wrong sequence, he suspected, would trigger something, a hidden mechanism. He didn't know what, but he was betting it wasn't good. As the first hint of gray light touched the eastern sky, their plan was in place. It was a desperate, suicidal gamble. Nate, carrying the heavy box, would ride into the canyon alone. Linda insisted on coming, her face pale but resolute. "They are my children," was all she said. Nate couldn't argue. He gave her a pistol and a role to play. Jed and his 6 men, armed with rifles, were already gone, having ridden through the night to circle around the high ridges of the canyon. They would be in position, hidden among the rocks, waiting. Sunrise, the deadline. Nate and Linda rode toward Shadow Canyon, the heavy box tied to Nate's saddle. The air was still and cold. The world seemed to be holding its breath. As they entered the narrow mouth of the canyon, the rock walls rose up on either side, blotting out the sky. It felt like riding into a tomb. In the center of the canyon floor, a group of men waited. Raymond was there, his arm in a sling, a sneer on his face. And beside him, sitting calmly on a fine black horse, was a man Nate would have recognized anywhere. Marcus Thorne. He was older, his hair silvered at the temples, but his eyes were the same, cold, arrogant, and utterly devoid of mercy. He held the reins of 4 small ponies. Tied to the saddles were Leo, Tom, and little Ruth. They were gagged, their eyes wide with terror. "Callahan," Thorne said, his voice smooth and cultured, a sound that made Nate's skin crawl. "You've caused me a great deal of trouble. I do dislike untidiness." "Where's Nal?" Nate demanded, his eyes scanning the group. Thorne had taken 3 children, but Nal wasn't there. A new, terrible fear gripped him. Thorne smiled, a chilling, predatory expression. "The older girl?" "She was. Uncooperative. A lesson was required. Let's just say she won't be joining us." A roar of pure, animalistic rage erupted from Linda's throat. She spurred her horse forward, raising her pistol. "You monster! I'll kill you!" "No!" Nate yelled, grabbing her reins. It was a trick. Thorne was trying to provoke them, to make them act rashly. Temper, Thorne chided. "A simple transaction is all that's required. The box, if you please. Then you can have what's left of your pathetic family." Nate dismounted slowly, untying the box. He placed it on the ground between them. "The children first, Thorne. Let them go." "I don't think so," Thorne said. "The key, Callahan. Open the box. I want to see the ledgers with my own eyes before I dispose of you." This was it. The moment of truth. Nate knelt by the box. He pulled the heavy brass key from his pocket. He looked at Thorne, then at the terrified faces of the children. He inserted the key. He began to turn it. Not in the correct sequence he had discovered, but in the wrong one. Click, click, click. A faint whirring sound came from inside the box. Thorne's eyes narrowed. What was that? Nate stood up slowly. "That, Thorne, was a mistake. My mistake for thinking a man like you would ever honor a deal." He looked up at the canyon ridge. "Now!" he roared. From the rocks above, 7 rifles opened fire, not at Thorne's men but at the scree-covered slopes above them. The crack of the rifles echoed like cannon fire through the canyon. An avalanche of rock and stone began to thunder down the canyon walls, cutting off the only exit. Thorne's men panicked, firing wildly at the unseen shooters. In the chaos, Linda galloped forward, cutting the ropes that held the children. "Get them!" she screamed at Nate. Nate sprinted, grabbing Ruth and Tom, and shoved them toward Linda. "Go! Get out of the canyon!" Raymond spurred his horse, trying to intercept them, but a rifle shot from the ridge kicked up a cloud of dust in front of him, turning his horse aside. Nate turned back to face Thorne. The Baron was livid, his face a mask of fury. "You fool! You've trapped us all!" "Not all of us," Nate said calmly. "Just you." Thorne drew a small, elegant pistol from his coat. "I'll still have the pleasure of killing you myself." But before he could fire, another figure appeared, stepping out from behind a large boulder near the canyon wall. It was the sheriff, flanked by 2 deputies, their shotguns leveled. And beside the sheriff, looking small but fierce, was Nal. She was unharmed. Jed had gotten her out during the night. Thorne's boast had been a lie, a cruel psychological game. Thorne froze, his eyes darting from Nate to the sheriff to the avalanche sealing his fate. He was trapped, utterly and completely. "It's over, Thorne," the sheriff said. "We've got testimony. We've got witnesses, and I believe Mr. Callahan has some evidence for us." Nate tapped the puzzle box with his boot. "It's all in here, but I'm afraid the lock is broken." The whirring sound inside the box grew louder, followed by a soft hissing. A thin, acrid smoke began to seep from the seams. "My father hated men like you," Linda said, having returned to Nate's side. "He always said bullies who hide behind paper deserve to have their secrets turned to ash." Thorne stared at the box, realization dawning on his face. The secret compartment wasn't just holding ledgers. It was lined with phosphorus. The incorrect key sequence hadn't unlocked it. It had triggered a chemical reaction. The evidence that could have destroyed him was now destroying itself. He let out a roar of frustration. He had lost. But as the deputies moved in to arrest him, Thorne gave Nate one last look. It was a look of pure, undiluted hatred, a look that promised that fences and prison bars were only temporary inconveniences. As they led him away, a broken man whose empire was crumbling, Nate pulled Linda and her children close. They were safe, for now. He looked around the canyon, at the dust settling, at the loyal faces of Jed and his men on the ridge above. He had spent 10 years building a fortress to keep the world out, but in the end, he hadn't saved himself by hiding. He'd been saved by letting the world in, by letting in a desperate woman, 4 brave children, and a fight that was worth more than any fortune. The war was won, but the battle for a new life was just beginning. The dust of Shadow Canyon settled, but the silence that followed was a living thing. It was the silence of survival, of a future that had almost been erased. Back at the ranch, the children slept, a deep, exhausted sleep, free from nightmares for the first time in years. Nala, safe and sound, was curled at the foot of her mother's bed, a silent guardian. In the main room, the fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Nate sat in his heavy armchair, cleaning his rifle with slow, deliberate movements. Jed sat across from him, sipping a cup of coffee, his own shotgun resting against the hearth. Linda was on the floor, stitching a tear in young Leo's shirt, her hands, for once, not trembling. "Thorne will be put away for a long time," Jed said, breaking the comfortable quiet. Attempted kidnapping, assault. The list is a mile long. The U.S. Marshals are taking him back east. You won't have to worry about him again. Nate nodded, but his eyes were distant. Men like Thorne have long memories, and long arms. "Then we'll have to have longer ones," Jed said simply. He stood up, stretching his weary bones. "Well, I'd best be getting back to my own place. Martha will be wondering if I got myself shot." He paused at the door, turning to look at the scene. Nate, Linda, the quiet rhythm of a home settling into itself. "This place is different now, Nate," he said, a rare smile touching his lips. "It's better." When he was gone, a new kind of silence fell, softer and more intimate. "You didn't have to do it," Linda said, not looking up from her sewing. "The box, the evidence, it was your chance to clear your name, to get your old life back." Nate stopped cleaning the rifle. He looked at the fire, at the way the flames consumed the wood, turning it into warmth and light. "That life is gone. It turned to ash a long time ago. That box, it was your father's justice, not mine. My justice is right here." He looked around the room, at the small sleeping forms in the adjoining bedroom, at the woman sitting by his fire. Linda finally looked up, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, there were no walls between them, no fear, no secrets. There was only a shared history forged in terror and courage. "What now, Nate?" she asked, her voice soft. "Now," he said, standing up and walking over to her. He knelt down in front of her, taking the needle and thread from her hands. "Now we build. We fix the barn. We plant a garden. We teach the boys how to ride. We teach the girls how to read better than any teacher in Helena." He gently took her hand. It was calloused and worn, but it fit perfectly in his. "We live, Linda, quietly, peacefully, together." Tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of relief, of a hope she had long ago believed was a fool's dream. "The children," she whispered, "they love it here. They think of you as—" She trailed off, unable to say the word. "I know," Nate said, his own voice thick with emotion, "and I think of them as mine." It wasn't a grand declaration of love. It was something quieter, deeper, a statement of fact, a foundation being laid. A year passed. The seasons turned, painting the valley in the vibrant colors of life. The Callahan Ranch was no longer a fortress of solitude. It was a home, teeming with the sounds of children's laughter and the low, contented murmuring of livestock. The barn was rebuilt, stronger than before, with no dark symbols carved into its beams. A sprawling garden bloomed with vegetables and flowers under Linda's patient care. Nate taught Leo and Tom how to handle a horse, how to mend a fence, how to read the land. He saw in them a strength and goodness that the world had not yet managed to tarnish. Linda and Nal spent the evenings reading by the fire, their voices weaving stories that filled the old house with warmth. Little Ruth, no longer a timid toddler, followed Nate everywhere, her small hand tucked securely in his, chattering away about her discoveries: a frog, a shiny rock, a feather from a blue jay. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun set the sky ablaze in shades of orange and purple, the mail rider brought a letter. It was from a law office in the east. Nate opened it, his face calm. He read it aloud to Linda as they sat on the porch swing, watching the children chase fireflies in the twilight. Marcus Thorne had died in a federal prison. His empire had been dismantled, his name now a synonym for greed and corruption. It was over. Truly, finally, over. Linda leaned her head on Nate's shoulder, a long, slow sigh of relief escaping her lips. "It feels like a story from another life," she said. Nate wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. It was. That night, after the children were asleep, Nate led Linda out to the barn. He had been working on something in secret for weeks. He lit a lantern, and in its soft, golden glow, he revealed his work. It was a sign, beautifully carved from a single piece of polished oak. In elegant, flowing letters it read, "Callahan and Sons Ranch Est, a long, long time ago." Linda traced the letters with her finger, her heart swelling. "And daughters," she corrected him softly, a smile in her voice. Nate grinned. "And daughters," he agreed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. It wasn't a puzzle box. It was simple, elegant. He opened it. Inside was a simple gold band. "I know we never really talked about it," he said, his voice a low, nervous rumble. "We've been too busy living, but Linda Rock, I was hoping you might consider changing your name one more time." Linda's laughter was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. It was bright and free, and full of a joy that he had helped put there. "I think," she said, taking his face in her hands, "that Linda Callahan has a nice ring to it." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. They stood there in the quiet barn, the scent of hay and horses all around them, the silence filled not with emptiness, but with the profound, unshakable peace of a family finally home. Nate Callahan, the man who fled the world, had found his entire world in the heart of a woman and her 4 children. He had sought solitude, but found salvation. They had faced down storms, both real and human, and emerged into the calm, not broken, but stronger, forged into something new, a family. And they knew, with a certainty that settled deep in their bones, that no shadow could ever touch them again. I really hope you enjoyed that story of justice, survival, and the power of found family. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't hidden in a box, but in the people who stand by you when the storms hit. If stories like this are what you love, do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel, and it means you'll never miss another adventure. Drop a comment below and let me know your favorite part. Was it the stampede, the final showdown, or the quiet moment on the porch? I read every single one. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.